All right, hear me out. If it's a bad idea, but it works, is it really a bad idea? Well, today we're going to find out when we attempt to fix the oil drain pan plug threads in my son's 2008 Volkswagen R32. Let's get started. The R32 is a somewhat rare performance version of the Golf, and my son found this one as a project car and worked really hard to get it back on the road and running properly. See, this car was not cared for very well by the previous owners, and it needed all kinds of work to even get it running when he bought it. It needed timing chains, a new clutch, a new flywheel, as well as a whole list of other minor issues. Today, we're attempting to permanently solve one of those minor issues, a cross-threaded oil drain plug. When he first bought the car, the drain plug that was installed was not only the wrong size, but had been severely cross-threaded into the aluminum oil pan, and the factory original drain plug would just never fit correctly again. So, once he finished up the rest of the engine work, as a temporary solution, we drilled out the old chewed up threads and tapped it at a larger size. Then we just used a bolt from the hardware store with a gasket to serve as his drain plug. This has worked out fine for about 5,000 miles, but there's some concern that over time this solution will further weaken the already fragile aluminum threads through repeated oil changes. Also, my son would really like to install a Fumoto drain valve to make oil changes easier and less messy, but unfortunately they don't make one in the size that we drilled and tapped the new drain plug hole. So today we're going to make our own reducing adapter out of a bolt, and then we'll use that to install the drain valve so that future oil changes will be easier and won't potentially damage the threads of the drain pan. Now, I'm sure some of you are screaming at your screen right now that reducers like this already exist. Why don't we just buy one off the shelf? Well, the sizes involved here are a little bit weird. And we looked everywhere, both online and at our local hardware suppliers, and I could not find this exact combination of sizes, particularly at the correct length. So we're just going to have to make our own. We started by marking the center on the head of the new bolt, and then used a punch to put a small divot at that center point so that the drill would not walk around as we started the hole. With a little bit of lubricant applied, we first drilled out a small pilot hole and then switched to the correct drill size that's needed for the tap that we'll use later, and finished drilling all the way through the center of the body of the bolt. As much as I'd like to recommend this as a pretty basic do-it-yourself project, you are going to need to have a drill press to do this particular step. I don't think it's realistic to think you'll be able to drill this out by hand and keep it straight enough. Even with carefully marking the center and using a drill press, we still wound up with a hole that's not quite perfectly centered, but it's good enough for our application. Next, we tap the bolt with internal threads the exact size that are needed by the drain valve that we'll be installing. I recommend doing this by hand, as taps are very easy to break if you use power tools. I recommend using lubricant here and going slowly. Take your time and cut about a half to maybe a full turn or so of the threads at a time. Then stop, back up the tap, and break off the chips. We repeated this process until we tapped the full length of the bolt. Then, to help ensure a flat sealing surface, I cut off the head of the bolt so we were left with just a sleeve. And I also added a little chamfer to the end that would mate with the adapter to accommodate a small shoulder in the adapter housing. With this finished, a quick test fit showed that everything was looking really good and fit up nicely. So next we'll add some thread sealant. We'll use this Loctite 574 to seal the threads. This stuff cures in the absence of oxygen, in the presence of metal, and it's oil resistant and will even cure if it gets oil on it. So this is going to be perfect for this application. I was pretty generous with the thread sealant and wound up with a big gob of the stuff inside the adapter that I blew out with compressed air. Always check to make sure that the internal path is clear when adding sealant like this. While we let that joint start to set up, we drained the oil from the engine, replaced the oil filter, and then did our best to clean out the existing threads in preparation to install the new adapter and valve. Next, I added a generous amount of sealant to the external threads, then headed under the car to install it, which is where I noticed a small problem. Alright, we got to pivot real quick here. This is the plug that we pulled out that was our temporary bolt. And you may notice the amount of threads that are on this one here are a little bit longer than the amount of threads that were on the bolt that we just pulled out. So I need to cut this down just a little bit, cut about 3 or 4 threads off the end, because as I recall, there isn't room in that pan for a very long bolt. It can be this long, but it can't be this long. So we're gonna clean off all of that and trim it down, and then we'll try again. So I cleaned all the sealant off and then marked how much I needed to remove using the old bolt as a guide. Next, I used a hacksaw to carefully cut off the excess length, and once this was done, I removed the burrs from the cut and then very carefully cleaned out the internal threads so that none of the metal shavings I just created were left over. Alright, I finished shortening this up and cleaning out the threads on the inside, and as you can see now it's exactly the same length as the bolt that I pulled out that we'd been using as a temporary bolt for the last few months. So I'm going to reapply that thread locker to these outer threads and we'll get it installed in the car. After reapplying some sealant to the outside, we could finally get under the car, add a little bit more sealant to the threads on the oil pan, and then thread in the new adapter, cleaning off excess sealant as it squeezed out. Now, since we're in uncharted territory with respect to torque specs, I mean we've tapped our own hole and made our own threads, we were careful not to over torque this, and since it's a German car, we just made sure it was good and tight. The last step under the car was to install the locking clip to prevent the valve from accidentally opening up while the car is running, and my son was really happy with how clean the final install looked when it was finished. We filled the car back up with oil, started it up, and checked for leaks. Ready? Yep. We just ran it long enough to circulate oil throughout the engine and fill up the oil filter. Then we shut it off, topped off the oil one more time, and checked for leaks. After seeing everything was dry underneath, we started it back up and let it run a little bit longer. Ready?
Yeah. You can give us some more revs too.
Okay. Maybe a lot. Is that what you said?
If you want.
Oh, if I want.
If you want, it's fine.
All right, here we go. Sounds pretty good.
That's pretty loud under there.
We left it parked overnight so the sealant could cure completely, and then verified again the next morning there were still no leaks. Alright, at the beginning of this video I said if it's a bad idea but it works out, maybe it's not such a bad idea after all. Well, so far this seems to be working out. It's not dripping at all, it seems to be holding the oil just fine, so I'm curious what you think. Have you ever tried to solve a problem like this in a pretty unconventional way, and how did it work out for you? Let me know about that down in the comments down below, and if you've got other suggestions of things I could have tried that might have been a better idea or something that you have had experience works better, I'd love to hear about that as well. And if you want to see more content like this, of course, you can always think about subscribing, but there's never any pressure from me on that, of course, and as always, thanks for watching. Remember kids, when you change your oil, you should also change your air filter. And Volkswagen has blessed us with many, many Torx connectors.
Put one there.
You need another extension?
Got it.
All right.